Alright, hello and welcome to my angry rant on who Carl Jung is, what his theory of collective unconsciousness is, what the cultural context surrounding it being kind of accepted by the public was, and why I don't think he really understood evolution at the time, even though he was making his theory after, like, Darwin's theories were already quite popular, and this was a cultural time in which psychology was going towards incorporating those animal behaviors as a way to study humans. It's strange. Essentially, first off, Carl Jung, who he was born in Switzerland to a family where his father was Protestant and very into preaching religion and being dogmatic about it, but also had a lot of clear doubts himself about it, which was this unusual combination that led to Jung kind of having a on-off relationship with religion, where he said he always believed there was a god of some kind, and the way he talks about it, you can kind of tell it's sort of associated with like a Western Christian view of God, but he doesn't ascribe to any specific policy necessarily. He sort of says that he flipped between a ton of them throughout his life and never really accepted any specific doctrine as wholly true, which you can see in this theory of collective unconscious, which we'll get to in a minute, and especially with his connection to Freud. This is another important thing for him. So he was this popular psychologist at the time, right? He was a contemporary of Freud. He was like Freud's BFF. Goes alongside Freud, where they were both after this era of therapeutic idealism, where people had no clue of what to do exactly, right? We talked about this in class. Essentially, they were saying, we don't know what's going on with trying to help patients. We can't find anything that actually helps them. We tried hypnotism, didn't work. So we're out of ideas. Any idea is good, which is why you get people who have these theories that don't really have any empirical evidence. They just sort of made things up, but sometimes they had some good ideas. So you get stuff like Freud's talk therapy and Carl Jung's collective unconsciousness thing. So, I mean, okay, first off, his main connection to Freud is that they were both in that same space of developing those therapies, and they contacted each other a lot about developing these theories, but also religion. They had a big divide where they didn't agree on religion, and the aspect they didn't agree on wasn't whether there was a god necessarily. This is an important part. It was specifically whether it was pragmatic to believe in God. Freud believed religion was like bad for people and an illusion. Carl Jung believed it was good for people and could help them as part of his therapy practices. This brings us to the theory of the collective unconsciousness. How did he believe religion could help people? So, the idea of the collective unconsciousness, the base of it is he had a similar idea of the unconscious to Freud, right, initially, where you've got how Freud has the id, ego, and superego. It's a similar idea, but he describes them instead as the, like, conscious state, and then there's the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious. The collective unconscious is the new layer that Freud doesn't really have, though it has a connection to Freud's whole thing with dreams. It's just that it's a little more supernatural even than Freud believed, for lack of better wording, where he thought that below the level of personal consciousness, which is what you have in your mind latently that you don't know about, there was some kind of, like, psychic network of ancestral memory that connected all of humanity and caused things, like, his evidence for this was, well, essentially two main things. First, things appearing consistently in cultures and fiction when the cultures weren't necessarily connected to each other and didn't have overlap. So he's like, how did two different people get the same idea? That's where the evolution thing comes in, but we'll get to that. And then additionally, he uses evidence people's dreams and fears, especially, where he'd say, like, this kid is afraid of snakes, but he's never seen a snake in his life. So clearly there's some kind of psychic ancestral memory from his ancestors who were killed by snakes, making him fear snakes. If this sounds familiar to people thinking about Darwin, it's because I feel like there was another explanation here that he was kind of missing, but he had the right spirit. He had the idea of it. And how he believed this could help people is this idea. It's a little odd because Freud, right, his idea of the way his theory could help patients was pretty based in his whole situation with Anna O, where he had a case where he showed that someone got better from his talk therapy and from, he thought, his psychoanalytic ideas. Even if you could argue maybe it wasn't necessarily those ideas that made it work, it still worked. Whereas Carl Jung, he didn't really have a way for this to work. This idea called individuation he had, where how it was supposed to help people. Hold on. So how Carl Jung believed that this idea could help people of the collective unconscious was that he thought that somehow you could incorporate this unconscious layer of existence that underlies all humans, but not our mind specifically, just some theoretical other layer, like dualism style. He thought you could take that and somehow incorporate it into your own conscious and unconscious, and I guess achieve some kind of enlightened state. He isn't super clear on how this is supposed to help people. He calls it individuation, where he's also focused a lot on this idea of the God image. I think a lot of the idea of it is like I said, he believed that religion could help people, and he saw religion and like the idea of there being gods, since again, people independently come up with the idea of gods a lot. So at least that part, he had like the cultural evolution idea down. He thought that was helpful to people, and kind of framed that under the idea of the collective unconscious, where he said, if you can take that idea that comes from the collective unconscious of there being a God and use it to like inspire you or something, then that could be helpful, I think is what he was trying to say. It's really hard to tell because he was really esoteric, even more than like Freud. This is what I mean by, with Freud, there's kind of an obvious application for it. Individuation is like more, it sounds like wizard stuff to read, but I think that's the idea of it. And the part where that gets sort of weird is, again, nobody, like, it wasn't about whether it was true. And I guess he disagreed with Freud massively in the sense that Freud had this idea of the delusion, right? He thought religion was a delusion and therefore harmful. But Carl Jung technically also kind of might have seen it as a delusion. We don't really know, but it seems like he didn't 100% believe in the idea of any specific God, even if, again, he thought there was one. He was like kind of agnostic. So he would have thought, even if I don't agree with your belief specifically in religion, like he doesn't think it's necessarily real, but he still thinks it's helpful to people regardless of what the truth of the universe is, just based on what's going on in their own head. So it was kind of pragmatic in that sense. It's just that it didn't really get popularized the same way as Freud's stuff because, again, less obvious on how to do it or explain it to people. And, well, the other thing here is there are other explanations for this than the collective unconscious. Like I said, the collective unconscious, when you think about it too hard, immediately starts to become confusing under the whole lens of, as I mentioned earlier, Darwinism and the whole theory of evolution, where you can apply that not to animals but to cultural ideas and see how convergent evolution could occur without the intervention of this magic psychic network connecting all humans. So for instance, why does a kid get dreams about snakes even though they've never seen a snake? Not because of ancestral memory exactly, but because humans have evolved to often fear snakes, because presumably in our history there were people who were getting killed off by snakes, most likely. Another alternate explanation for this that kind of like a similar, or kind of the same explanation but with a different lens on it, related to the history of novels too, would be essentially, I like to compare it to Tolkien's essay on fairy stories, where like Tolkien, as in J.R.R. Tolkien, the guy who wrote Lord of the Rings, he had this whole idea of, he goes on this long rant about what constitutes a fairy story. And he has a very specific idea of it and says that just having fairies in your story isn't enough to make it a fairy story. You have to have all of these specific genre conventions and tropes and thematic ideas connected to like ancient European fae in order to make it what people see as a fairy story. And that idea of having, again, certain conventions in writing that are there for the pragmatic purpose of making an audience, like trying to elicit a specific feeling in your audience, and especially with the consideration that there would be pressures from an audience to create certain ideas and give them certain feelings that they'd be more likely to like and like publish your fiction. So for instance, if you're thinking about the idea of a cameo, that's technically a trope. Cameos are in everything. They're in the ancient Greek Iliad. The ancient Greek Iliad didn't get cameos that we still have today because of a psychic connection. They got it because it's a way to put a character in your story that your audience cares about, so you can make them care about other things that they don't care about yet. It's just a tool that comes into existence naturally due to the nature of writing. So in that case, it was like the catalog, where they'd have the names of all these local heroes, and then they'd have the bards going around reciting the Iliad, and it'd be like, oh look, that's Hercules. I know the guy who was around my town who's in this specific poem, and therefore I'm going to care about the thing this bard's saying more and give him money. Similar idea to that. We still use stuff like that today with the Marvel movies and things, and that's not because of the collective unconscious. So you can see where there are other ways in which to examine it. There's like a third variable problem where he was making a correlation, Carl Jung, and he was ascribing it as causation. And the cause, the thing he thought was causing it, was this collective unconscious thing, kind of making up a cause for it in a sense, when there were in fact causes for it that he just hadn't figured out yet. Even though, again, the evolution idea was already around by now, so I guess he just didn't think of that. Or he was more inclined to believe supernatural things, which, on that topic, it is considered a psychical area of research. I don't think Carl Jung would have put it that way. I couldn't find information on whether he did, but the articles that we have for classes readings do slot the theory of the collective unconscious in as part of psychical, like spiritualist adjacent psychology and folk psychology ideas. So if it's mostly this kind of slightly pseudoscientific thing that Carl Jung sort of made up, is there anything we can still get of the collective unconscious, or that is still relevant to psychology today? I would say definitely yes. Specifically because it had that idea of the personal unconscious, right? Where it wasn't quite the same as Freud's idea. For Freud, his concept of the unconscious was the whole id thing, where he thought it was this repressed set of desires, right? He specifically thought your unconscious, that your body wanted things, or your mind wanted things that you didn't know about them, but that it would manifest into your actions somehow eventually, or your dreams. And Carl Jung had, because the collective unconscious consists of all these concepts, these archetypes that he thought would show up again and again in the same fashion as a trope, it includes beliefs, like about the God thing, for instance. And because of that, he had, earlier than a lot of people, an idea of the unconscious that involved your knowledge of the environment and what you believe in, which is still kind of what we believe in today, like in the sense of, I had as an example in the write-up version of this, the part from a emotional motivation textbook about cognitive dissonance, which is a phenomenon where people will feel bad because they have some kind of unconscious belief that's being violated. They're not immediately thinking about that belief all the time, and they might not even be able to pinpoint why exactly they feel sort of icky. But it's this pretty well-supported idea that people have unconscious beliefs about themselves or their environment. In this case, the example it uses for cognitive dissonance is most people believe that they're, to some extent, like, just and a good person. And if their actions aren't lining up with that and they feel hypocritical, then even if they're not consciously thinking about it, that unconscious belief will cause them some emotional turmoil. And yeah, that idea of the unconscious as containing kind of our knowledge and understandings of reality, our mental schemas of how things are, like for instance prototypes, that's a really well-supported idea in psychology too, that we have certain basic beliefs about what constitutes a specific object or thing, and like how we would depict that in absence of actual examples of it. But we have ideas in our brain of an example of how things are, and he was kind of onto that before a lot of people really started talking about it fully, and did probably eventually contribute to the popularization of that concept, because he was, again, a lot of that idea of the unconscious we attribute it all to Freud, saying, oh yeah, he came up with people having that latent layer. But Carl Jung, again, was working with him, basically had the same idea, just his is kind of, in some ways, I'd say more accurate to reality. Again, not the collective unconscious thing, really. The effects he posited from it are real, but the cause, not at all. I mean, I guess you can't exactly say you're disproving it either, but there are definitely simpler explanations than a magical psychic link that blasts you with wizard powers and makes you come up with these same tropes as everyone else. In the case of Freud's, though, it wasn't quite as accurate to the real world as the unconscious idea that we kind of got from Carl Jung, even if it doesn't necessarily get attributed to him so much. So I think that despite my hating on his ideas, essentially, I do think that he was important and helpful, and he did mean well. Like, he had the right ideas, and I think the individuation idea can probably help people. He just didn't explain it in a way that was easy enough for people to understand in the everyday psychology element, for instance, in order for it to get super popularized. Yeah.